Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. I'm Lynn Bauer. Since watercolor is a transparent medium, we can't always paint over things if we don't get them down the way we wanted the first time. So we typically make some planning marks to guide us in placing things on the page. The usual way to do this is to make an underdrawing, which is simply an outline drawing in pencil. In many situations, this works just fine, but occasionally there are some problems. If you're new to watercolor or feeling a little uncertain about this painting, sometimes those lines can exert a bit too much influence, and you feel like what you need to do is color them in like a coloring book. And this leads to sort of a coloring book look, which is fine if you wanted to have that for stylistic reasons, but not so much if you'd prefer a more natural, less stylized look. Or suppose you wanted to indicate where to place shadows in a painting of a flower, but you didn't want to see pencil lines around the shadows in the finished painting. Fortunately, there are some alternatives to a traditional pencil underdrawing. One of the simplest modifications is to simply not use outlines for everything, but make other types of marks to indicate where to place things. I like to use the phrase planning marks instead of underdrawing in my own head to remind myself that this doesn't have to look like a drawing. It just needs to help me figure out where to put things. So with trees, for example, if I indicate where the trunk and the main branches are with dotted lines or even solid lines, that's enough for me to know where the crown and the foliage needs to go. In the water, I've used dotted lines to remind myself that these are just sort of directional lines and not something I'm going to paint up to and then stop. And just a reminder, these marks are much darker than I would normally make them so that they'll show up on the video. In real life, I would make these dots just dark enough that I could see them well enough to place my washes. Another alternative is to make your planning marks with a watercolor pencil using a color that's similar to the area where you need those planning marks. And you could even use different colors in different parts of the painting. And as before, I've made these marks darker for the video than I would make them for an actual painting. Be sure to test your watercolor pencils to see how much color they're going to release when you get them wet, and also to make sure you're not surprised by any color shifts. This looks like a sort of grayish blue, but when you get it wet, you discover it's actually a brighter blue, and you want to know that in advance. And you'll also want to make sure that if you're using those lines to indicate something for a second wash, that you don't fiddle too much with the first wash and erase them completely. One tip, if you're concerned about that, is to consider painting things in a different order. Do the shadows first. And then when those shadow shapes are completely dry, glaze over the entire flower, including the shadow shapes, with a paler yellow. This way, you don't have to worry about accidentally erasing your planning marks before you need them. And by the way, inexpensive watercolor pencils will work for this. A kid's set of Crayolas, they don't need to be light fast. You're only using them for planning marks. Just be sure to test your colors first and make sure there are no surprises. Another alternative is to use a dip pen and the same color watercolor you're going to use to paint that wash. You don't have to make enough to fill a little bottle to dip it in. You can load it with a brush like this, and then simply draw your outline with the same color that you're going to paint it with later. You can't really erase these marks, but you don't really want to erase on your watercolor paper anyway. It's better to transfer using a light box or a sunny window. If you don't know how to do that, there's a lesson in Watercolor Jumpstart, and I'll link to that in the video description. Another strategy that works well for soft transitions in water or sky or fur or fabric is to start with a pale wet and wet version and sneak up on the final version. I have some very pale dotted lines to indicate the ripple patterns in this water, and then I'm going to make my first statement of the shadow shapes in a very pale color. Again, paler than I would use for the video. And that way, if I don't like the first pass, I can make corrections in the next iteration and it will just blend in. No one will ever see it. And of course, you can use multiple methods and use whichever type of planning mark works best for different parts of the painting. In this case, I've used an outline drawing for the lighthouse. I have dotted lines for the top of the grass, and I've actually used a watercolor pencil for the tree trunks. If I lay a sky wash over this, it might blur a little bit, but that's okay, because when I come back with my foliage color, I'm going to just drop it in right on top of that. And the nice thing about this is it gives that sort of lost and found effect of branches and trunks sort of peeking through here and there instead of a solid line, which isn't really what you see when you look at a tree that's in full leaf. So there are some ideas for giving yourself a roadmap for where to place things in your watercolors that don't involve an outline around everything and pencil lines in your finished paintings where you didn't want them. I have some other ideas for you too, but I'm saving those for the next postcard paint along. So I hope this gets you started, and until next time, happy painting.